welcome you to Warwicks, the oldest family-owned and operated bookstore in the country, in operation since 1896, and last year named the best independent bookstore in the United States by Publishers Weekly. We would love it if you followed Warwicks on social media, go to our website, sign up for emails, and come to more events. We have between 150 and 200 author events a year in the store and around the county, so we'd love to have you join us. But tonight, I really want to welcome the New York Times best-selling author Becky Aikman as she discusses and signs her recently published book, Spitfires, the American Women Who Flew in the Face of Danger During World War II. She is in conversation with Ron Carrico, who has been a docent at the San Diego Air and Space Museum since 2006. He was also an Air Force pilot and an attorney in private practice in San Diego from 1978 to 2020. Becky is the author of 3 books of narrative fiction, Spitfires, which you'll hear about tonight, her memoir, Saturday Night Widows, and Off the Cliff, How the Making of Thelma and Louise Drove Hollywood to the Edge. She was also a journalist at Newsday, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and other publications, and she lives in New York. Becky's books are the kind of books I love, because through historical fiction, it tells the stories of women that historians have perhaps purposely ignored. Right?
They ignored them for one reason or
Yeah,
another.
well, whatever. This is the true story of daring American women who piloted the most dangerous aircraft of World War II through the treacherous skies of Britain. Before joining, they were all pilots to begin with. Crop dusters and debutantes, college girls, and performers in flying circuses. But because they were women, the United States denied them the opportunity to fly for their country when we entered World War II. But Great Britain, who was facing desperate times and would let anyone, even Americans and even women, transport airplanes, said, "Come on." Thus, 25 young aviators bolted for England in 1942, becoming the first American women to command military aircraft. Called Spitfires, the women were decades ahead of their time, risking their lives in one of the deadliest jobs of the war. They flew new, barely tested fighters and bombers to air bases and returned shot-up wrecks for repair, never knowing what might go wrong until they were high in the sky, and that takes guts. If not, craziness. Many pilots died in crashes or made spectacular saves. It was exciting, often terrifying work. The Spitfires broke new ground off duty as well, shocking their hosts with thoroughly modern behavior. Becky Aikman brings these heroines, or sheroes as I call them, to life, drawing on unpublished diaries, letters, and records along with her own interviews. We have somebody in the audience today who is the niece of one of the, right?
Yes.
One of the pilots here, so it's really kind of cool. It's a terrific book, giving depth to history not often told, and a vivid, richly detailed account of war, ambition, and a group of remarkable women, like many of you here today, whose lives were as unconventional as their dreams. So welcome, Becky Aikman. Thank you.
I guess this is how we start. Wow, look how many people are here. This is incredible. I'm rather surprised. Maybe you're not.
I expect it by now.
Well, listen, I was an Air Force pilot for 22 years, and I flew quite a bit in Europe. And I want to tell you, the weather in Europe, especially, well, when I flew, it's in the 60s mostly, the weather is terrible. And it's really hard to find your way around, especially since these women had to fly VFR, visual flight rules. Visual flight rules does not mean we follow roads. That's not what it means. Although that's what they did to find their way around, because there were no navigational aids. You know, if you ever drive down Mission Bay and you see that big white thing in the middle of that's a TACAN or VORTAC, and that's how you can find your way to San Diego Bay up to 100 miles away. They didn't have that. They also didn't have radios. So when I heard about this, two of my favorite things in the Air Museum are World War II Gallery and the Women in Aviation Gallery, especially Jacqueline Cochran. And you're going to hear more about Jacqueline Cochran in a little bit. I have read an awful lot of World War II aviation history. This is the best book I've ever read about it. It's really, really good.
We can stop right here.
So, at any rate, I'm going to start with just asking questions, if you don't mind, and we're going to have, after about 40 minutes or so, you'll all be able to have questions. So if you got a good question, you can write it down so you can ask it later on. So my first question, where did you get the idea to write this book?
It is a good question because this particular piece of history was completely forgotten by almost everybody. I had never heard of it. I was talking to my mother, who had been a young child during World War II, and telling her that I wished I could write a book about people who did something incredible, but no one knows about it. And without missing a beat, she said, write about the American women who flew in England during the war. I had never heard of this, so I started Googling and trying to find out, and I couldn't find out anything about it. So I went back to her and said, are you sure you aren't mistaken, or thinking maybe of the Wasp or something like that? And she said, no, I remember it distinctly. They were so noble and glamorous. I wished I could do what they did. So I thought, this is a worthy story. And I eventually found out that there was this organization in Great Britain that would accept pilots from around the world and would accept women. And I contacted a tiny little museum there that is the museum for that organization, the Air Transport Auxiliary, called the ATA. I spoke to the head of that museum. He confirmed that they had American women and gave me some names. And he said, I hope you don't plan to fictionalize this, because nothing could be as exciting and glamorous as the reality. So I knew this was going to be good. And I set about right away trying to track down information about these women. Since they'd been forgotten and weren't famous, there was no logical place to look for it. There were a few museums that had some of their papers. And luckily, the very first place I went was the San Diego Air and Space Museum, because I saw that one of the pilots, named Mary Zerbel, had donated her papers there. I went to see them, and the librarian said, I don't know if anyone's ever looked at this before. I looked through it and saw she led an amazing life. She was very famous even before the war as the youngest woman flying instructor in the United States at only the age of 19. And she was very famous during the war because she and her fiancé were the first American people serving in the war to marry in the war zone. And it was covered around the world. She was so well known throughout her early life that there was a movie made of her life starring Lana Turner. I thought, how have I never heard of this person? I got to the last page of the file in the museum, and there was her obituary. It was only 3 sentences long in a small town newspaper, and it didn't even mention she knew how to fly. So that was the moment when I vowed somebody had to bring this story back to life, and it looked like it would have to be me.
So how did they qualify? What did they have to do to qualify to be the pilots? And how were they contracted to apply?
The famous Jacqueline Cochran, who's already been mentioned here, she was a very famous woman aviator. She set many records, won many air races, was very highly placed and a friend of the Roosevelts. She wanted to start a flying force for women at the outset of the war. The U.S. still hadn't entered, but the U.S. military said no. But she knew about the British ATA, and she decided to find a group of American women and lead them over there. She contacted women who had more than 300 hours flying experience, sent them telegrams inviting them. This arrived out of the blue for these women. It was like a dream come true. She promised they could fly all the most advanced aircraft in the world, they would be paid, they would be in the war. They all said, sign me up. They had to go to Montreal to get a flight test with the Canadian Royal Air Force facilities there. They had to fly something called a Harvard AT-6, which was a big, loud, very powerful fighter trainer. Now, most of them had only ever flown little things like Piper Cubs that went 60 miles an hour. Suddenly they were in this super fast, super powerful, high horsepower fighter full of all kinds of gadgets and gizmos they had never heard of. It had flaps for the wings. They'd never done that before. They had a few hours to get familiar with it, and then they had to pass a flight test. This was the perfect introduction to the ATA, because the job in the ATA was to fly anything they threw at you with very little training. So somebody who could pass this flight test was the perfect person to be accepted in this job.
The thing with those in the Air Force, they call it the T6, and then the Navy calls it the SNJ. And an odd thing about it, it had so much torque and what they call propeller. But anyway, it takes a tremendous amount of right rudder, and you have to be pretty darn strong to push that rudder in. I've only flown one airplane like that. Anyway, so now they trained. They all didn't go over at the same time, though, did they?
Right. They decided to divide up. There were 25 women who were accepted. They divided them up so that they wouldn't all be lost at once if the ship they were on was sunk. Because at that time, beginning of 1942, very high percentage of the ships that went across the North Atlantic were sunk by submarines or German bombers. So they divided them into groups of 5 or 6. The first group went in March, and the final group went in August. So they were spread out over that time, and they traveled on cargo ships primarily that had never had women on board before. So that in itself was a pretty wild adventure.
Is that in the book?
Oh yes, it's in the book. There's a lot of detail about how the men were very excited to have them.
Yeah, one little known fact about the trend, they've lost as many as 300 ships a year going across the Atlantic, to the North Atlantic, to the submarines. And what really put a stop to that is when we start flying balloons in front of them. They only lost one ship with a balloon in front of it.
Wow.
That was pretty late in the war.
Yeah, the first woman went over on a ship that had been one of 6 sister ships, and the other 5 had all been lost, had been sunk in the North Atlantic, and it was the only one still operating.
So how many total pilots were there in the ATA, and how many of them were women?
There were about 1,200 pilots total in the ATA, and I believe it's about 180-something were women. Mostly British women, and then the US contingent was the next largest. But they were from all over the world. They were from South America, a lot of them from Poland, South Africa, various countries contributed. It was often called the Foreign Legion of the Air. And also, based on its initials, ATA, the first men who joined called themselves the Ancient and Tattered Airmen, and the first women who joined called themselves the Always Terrified Airwomen.
I don't think that's in the book.
Oh, it's there.
Oh,
There's so much there you can't remember
I
it all.
missed that part. So they get to there. They were not all at the same base.
No, once they got there, they did some initial training, and then they were sent off to various bases, and usually some of the Americans were together at one or the other. There were a few main ones where they were based. One was on the southern coast near Southampton, so it was very close to the action during D-Day. One was more in the middle of the country, where they stayed at the estate of a wealthy air enthusiast who let his airfield be requisitioned by the government, and they stayed at his very deluxe estate. It was Sir Lindsay Everard, and it was sort of a cross between Downton Abbey and a World War II movie. But in some of the others, they stayed in very little billets and cottages with people with no indoor plumbing, so they were never sure where they would wind up. But at each stage of their training, they were trained in one example of a type of aircraft. The first class was called Class 1, and it involved very small, light, single-engine planes. The second class was Class 2. They were single-engine but powerful, fast fighters like the Spitfires and Hurricanes. Step 3 was 2-engine aircraft, mostly bombers. Then the next one, 4, was large bombers. They would train on one example of each, and once they had flown that one example, they could be expected to fly any aircraft in that category without any previous training. They flew up to 147 different models of aircraft in the course of their service, and they had a little booklet called the Ferry Pilot's Notes. It had one page on each aircraft. It fit into a pocket. It would say, here's how you take off, here's how you land, here's how fast it goes. They would review it in the cockpit, put it back in their pocket, and take off.
Now, they had military rank, but they weren't necessarily exactly in the RAF.
Right. It was an auxiliary to the RAF.
And how about the pay?
The pay was quite good for the time. They were really pleased that they had this fantastic job flying these aircraft they would never have flown otherwise, and they were well paid. The British public was very grateful to the foreign pilots who came to help out. It was a dire situation there. Civilians were being killed all the time in air raids. So they were in a really idyllic job in terms of the respect that they got and the treatment that they got.
Now, in the Air Museum, we have a picture of Jacqueline Cochran, and we have the uniforms. We have, like, she donated a lot of stuff to us just before she passed. She passed in 1980, by the way. She set speed records. How about 1,400 miles an hour? And she set altitude records in a T-38, which I flew in pilot training. She got to 55,000 feet. How she did it, I don't know. When you train in the military, you generally only fly one airplane. And to fly like when I flew the F-4 Phantom, it was like a 3 or 4 month checkout to fly one airplane. So, and these women were flying lots of different airplanes. I can imagine how confusing that was.
I really think by the end of the war, they had to be some of the best pilots in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, there were excellent pilots who knew how to fly a Lancaster bomber, but they knew how to fly everything on little notice in crazy conditions. They had to be so talented and capable, it's hard to imagine.
There's a story about a really dangerous American airplane, the B-26. They called it Widowmaker, that sort of thing, and the American men were afraid to fly it. So General Doolittle had 2 American WASP pilots, Women's Air Force Service pilots, fly the airplane in for all the men to see. And then when they climbed out and combed their long blonde hair, the guys went, well, I guess we can do this.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
The job was a very dangerous job, which I imagine you can gather from what we're saying. And in fact, 1 in 7 pilots who served in the ATA were killed in crashes during the course of the war. So it was no lark.
One of my favorite stories from the book is right at the start. I mean, this is a great way to start the book. Tell us about Miss Raines. I think it's worth telling. It's only a couple of pages. But
Well, I concentrated on a few of the women in depth, and one of them was named Hazel Jane Raines. She was a stunt pilot from Georgia. And at the beginning of the book, I open with her taking off in a Spitfire fighter in early 1943. She was flying along and noticed a bank of clouds up ahead. She thought, this could turn into some trouble, I'll just keep an eye on it. Meanwhile, as she approached the cloud, her engine started to splutter and failed completely. At that point, she realized she would have to try to find a place to land on the ground. She had seen a place that she had passed that maybe would be flat enough to serve this purpose, so she began to turn to try to get there with no power. At that moment, she did enter the cloud. She was already in a turn. She had no orientation. This is one of the, well, both things are one of the worst things that can happen to you, to lose your engine, and to now be in a cloud sideways, unable to judge up from down, left from right. And she wound up in the situation that will often happen in these circumstances, which was she went into a spin, heading straight for the ground. She knew her only chance to be saved was if she got out of the clouds high enough still to be able to somehow straighten out the aircraft. Now, what many people wouldn't have known about her was that she was a stunt pilot in Georgia, and in air shows, she used to perform loops and spins, where she would spin close to the ground while the audience would scream in terror until she saved herself at the last minute. So if somebody had to be in this situation, she was the right one. When she got out of the cloud, she knew she was too low to save herself, but she did straighten out the Spitfire somewhat, to the point that she crashed sort of horizontally into the roof of a cottage in a small village. Now, it happened that this cottage had a thatched roof, which was 3 feet thick of hay, and it cushioned the crash just enough to save her life. The Spitfire itself was completely demolished. People in the town came to dig the dead man out, as they described it later. They pried open the cockpit, up popped this person, very much alive, who said, "London, guard that plane," which was what they were required to say in these circumstances. I'm not sure why. They all were completely shocked. First, the pilot was alive. Second, the pilot was a woman. And third, the pilot was clearly an American woman. She was bleeding profusely from the head, but she was alive and came back to fly again, although I would think many pilots would say, "I've had it after that one." That was a very good example in one instance of what could go wrong in these circumstances and what kinds of mettle these pilots had to have to save themselves in these conditions.
Now let's compare the ATA with the WASP, Women's Air Force Service Pilot.
Well, the ATA came first, and that was because Jacqueline Cochran wanted to start what became the WASP, and this was a semi-military organization that ferried aircraft throughout the United States. It never went abroad the way the ATA did. When she couldn't get the US military to start a women's flying force, she went to England specifically to try to prove that the women could do it. So during her time there, she wasn't very popular with the British. They really wanted her to fly, and she wanted to spend her time documenting and doing research and lobbying American officials to say, "Look how these women are doing, let's start what became the WASP." So she was only there through September of 1942 when she went back and they did start the WASP. So they were similar organizations, different experience for the women in each. In England, the women in the ATA were treated really well and highly regarded. The WASPs always had to face a fair amount of public criticism of women flying at all, and the organization was actually ended in 1944 when the war was still on because of public opposition to women pilots. So it was, some of the Americans who were in England did come back to join the WASP when it formed, and then they were out of a job after a while. But most of those who were in England decided to stay. They liked being in the center of the action. They liked that it was a more seat-of-the-pants operation where they could do what they wanted and be close to the war. So most of those who stayed were happy that they did.
Yeah, the American women in the WASP were not treated very well. They were summarily fired on December the 20th, 1944. The reason why is they had a lot of American men coming back that needed jobs, I guess. They just flat fired them. Didn't even pay for their freight home. If you can get a ride on an airplane, we'll do it. You know, you can jump on an airplane. They made them turn their uniforms. And the uniforms were actually designed by Jacqueline Cochran. And somehow we have one at the Air Museum. I don't know how that happened. But one of our docents said, well, she handed it to me at the museum one day. They're beautiful uniforms too.
The ATA uniforms were beautiful too, very chic.
Yeah, very chic. Describe the uniforms, they're really neat.
Well, they were made by tailors in London, custom made, and they were made out of beautiful wool, and there was a jacket and a skirt and a pair of pants. The jackets had a belt, so it was very flattering to a woman's figure. And at first, when women started to fly in the ATA, they were told that they had to wear their skirts while flying, which proved to be pretty awkward, climbing in and out of aircraft. So then they decided, all right, we will allow them to wear the pants to fly the planes. But they had to change into the skirts once they got on the ground. And famously, there was an officers' club that had a sign at the door that said, "Women must remove their trousers upon entry." Eventually, that was sort of just forgotten, and people wore what they wanted.
So there was of the women that were there, how many actually, of the 25 that started, how many actually finished in November of 45?
There were 8 who were still serving when the war ended, which was May of 45. And then I think about 4 remained afterwards, because at that point they were still transporting aircraft around the theater of war and getting supplies in and out of Germany for reconstruction and things like that. So those people stayed, but most of them left when the war ended.
How about some of the personalities? I think you used the term wild behavior at some point.
Well, the kind of woman who would have learned how to fly in the 1930s was already a very bold personality, because it was a really rare thing. So one thing I loved writing about these characters were that they were really distinct characters, and a complete cross-section of American society. For example, there was one woman who was a debutante from one of the wealthiest families in the country, the family of the Western Union fortune, the tech fortune of its time.
What was her name? I forget.
Virginia Farr. And she was raised...
She was also beautiful, as I recall.
Well, she's not the most beautiful. Well, there was another who was famous for being so beautiful. But she was raised to be a debutante and capture a wealthy husband, which was very awkward for her because she was attracted to women rather than men. So going to the war allowed her to live openly as she pleased. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of wealth was Dorothy Fury, and she was the famous beauty of the group. She was raised in a poor family in New Orleans. She only had an 8th grade education, but she was extremely beautiful and had tremendous power over men. When she joined, she saw this as an opportunity to remake herself. When she went to England, she took a single red dress that she recycled for every occasion. But primarily, aside from her beauty, she had a very imperious personality. So people in England assumed that she was some sort of American aristocrat. And she was invited to all the country houses of the British aristocrats and all the finest clubs in London. And one British lord held a ball and invited the entire airfield just for the opportunity to meet her. She very wisely used these assets and worked her way up the social ladder and became quite a major figure in British society, ultimately. And years after the war, I would see newspaper clippings about her referring to her as the American heiress, Dorothy Fury, which she was not, but she convinced everyone she was. Now, aside from that, there were people from all different backgrounds. One was a crop duster from California. Well, she was from Washington State originally. She dusted crops in California. And to make extra money, she appeared in an air show doing a mock striptease. She would fly over the airfield and toss out an item of clothing each time she went around. Then ultimately she would land fully clothed, but the audience was pretty impressed anyway. So that was another example of a really different background. And Anne Wood, who we've mentioned, was a college graduate, very ambitious, very much like a modern woman in that she used connections to try to get ahead and wanted an important job after the war. So it was a real mix. They really threw the British because the British women who flew were primarily very upper crust, and they expected that the Americans would be the same. So they were quite shocked at the boisterous behavior of the Americans on their arrival in Great Britain, and the Americans were well aware that they'd made a very poor impression at first.
And so the woman with the motorcycle, what was her name?
Oh, that was Winnie Pierce. She actually was a college graduate also, and she was a saleswoman for aircraft out of Long Island, where she would demonstrate the aircraft for the company that sold them. She was a really wild person. She loved doing things that were thrilling in the air and on the ground. She had a wild personal life, and she was quite undisciplined in the air. She broke the rules regularly and did what she pleased. The British were particularly displeased with her. But very early in her service, only I think the 3rd time she ever flew a Hurricane fighter, she took off from the factory where it had been manufactured, and on takeoff the engine failed. And this is considered one of the worst situations a pilot can be in, because you've lost your engine but you're not high enough in the air to really figure out a way to get down and save yourself or the aircraft. The ATA told all these pilots, if this happens to you, go straight ahead and crash. It's your best chance of survival. They said, whatever you do, do not try to turn around and go back to the airport, because you will tip over, you won't have enough speed, you'll crash. Being Winnie Pierce, she immediately decided she was going to break the rules and she was going to turn around and go back to the airport. It's something that's known as the impossible turn by pilots, because it is considered pretty much impossible. But she somehow did it. It took tremendous skill and just, I don't know, natural instincts to understand just how fast you can go, just how far you can turn, just how you deal with the change of wind speeds trying to turn around. She pulled it off. So the British at that point had to acknowledge that while they might roll their eyes at her personal behavior, they did understand that she was a really talented pilot.
Or lucky.
Or lucky. Well, she never made a mistake any other time throughout the war. She never damaged an aircraft or herself, so.
Now, she had a very interesting husband as well.
Yes, one of her many crazy affairs was with a sort of well-known man about town who was somewhat mysterious, and not to give away too many spoilers, but there was a strong possibility that he was a spy.
And they ended up living where?
In New Mexico, near Los Alamos.
Little town called Tesuque. How many people have been to Tesuque, New Mexico? Well, we have. It's very small. Okay, now the troublesome part. To me, this is the problem. They really expected aviation careers after the war. How'd that work out?
Well, to say they expected it might be going a bit far. They understood what they were up against. They were watching very carefully what was happening with the WASP in the US and realizing that there was not a great environment for women to get hired as pilots when they went back home. So all of them did their utmost to fly as many different models of aircraft as possible, to contribute as much to the war as possible, so that when the war was over, they could not be denied as women who should be hired to fly aircraft. When they came back to the United States, the US military still would not hire women pilots, and no American passenger airline would hire women pilots. So again, not to do too many spoilers, it was really tough for them. The people who managed to succeed had to be extremely resourceful, find ways to fly that were outside of the normal paths that pilots would take. One of them, who lived very near here, still lives very near here, was one of the top pilots. She flew through the end of the war, all kinds of aircraft. She always got herself transferred to the worst air bases and the worst places so that she could fly more and more types of planes. When she came home, she couldn't get any job except at a flight school in Oregon, where part of her job was cleaning the bathrooms. In her free time, however, she learned how to become a helicopter pilot. She became only the second woman in the United States to become a certified commercial helicopter pilot. She went to Alaska and started the first Alaska helicopter charter company, which became extremely successful. So she turned out to have a great career. Another of the women, along with her husband, started a company, a private company, kind of like the ATA, where they would pick up some dicey aircraft in Thailand that somebody wanted to buy in Brazil and get it to them. That was also a kind of crazy and scary job, but that was successful, and one of the women became the first woman vice president of a major US airline. And one of them rose pretty high in the Air Force, although never allowed to fly. So they found their way, a lot of them, because as you've gathered by now, these were some pretty resourceful women, and they did find ways to succeed, just not as well as they deserved to, in my opinion.
Now they got together again in 1979.
Yeah,
I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, they were really independent people, and they didn't get together much, but in 1979, the remaining crew did reunite in New Mexico, and By that time,
Probably having margaritas there. So.
I'm sure they did. Winnie Pierce was the hostess. They had come to understand that what they had done was really trailblazing. They realized nobody besides them knew it, but they did understand that, and they all said that at the time, during the war, they never really thought they were doing this for women. They were doing it for the free world, they were doing it for themselves, but they realized that they had been the first to take so many steps that it took decades for other women to be allowed to make. So it was a bittersweet moment. They could get together and celebrate themselves, but they deserved a bigger celebration than that, which I'm hoping they are going to get now.
So one more thing I should add about the WASP. When they were all fired from the military, there was no reference again ever about them anywhere. And in 1977, Barry Goldwater introduced a bill to Congress, which was finally signed to allow them to be access to be in the military and recognized as such and get military benefits for the WASP pilots. I don't know if I can't remember if there was any money involved in it or what, but I think we're running close on time. I bet there's a lot of questions, but I got one more thing. One of the coolest part of the book I thought was the end of the book, a reference to a meeting at an airport where one of the people had been in Paris. I think this is a great story because it brings in there's a big star in women's aviation as far as I'm concerned.
Well, toward the end of the war, all the women were trying to maneuver somehow to get work. And one of them who had formed so many connections she thought would come through for her, none of them were coming through. And in desperation, she made a phone call to one last person. That person said, "I'm in Paris now, I'm flying over, I'll be in London, meet me at the airport." It was Jacqueline Cochran. And she managed to find a tremendous job for this person and got it done, despite many other people who you would have thought would have helped her and did not. So Jacqueline Cochran kept appearing throughout this story.
So what was the first year an American airline had a female pilot?
Oh, God. It's in the end of the book.
I think it's 73.
I was going to say 73, and then I thought, am I remembering it wrong? Yeah, 73. If you remember it, that's what it is.
And the first Air Force or Navy fighter pilot, female.
It's also in the end of the book. Do you remember? You remember.
I think it was about 88, about 1990 or so. I actually met her.
I was going to say 93.
92.
Yeah,
92.
sounds
She
good.
was an underclassman of mine.
Wow.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay, 92. That sounds about right to me. Yeah, I mean, look, these women did all this in the early 40s.
Yeah.
That's how long it took for other women to get the opportunity. It's crazy.
Next question. What percentage of American airline pilots are women?
Well, I've heard 5%.
Yeah, I looked it up on Wikipedia. I was amazed how low it is. So, but they have kids and things like that. And that's actually, I wasn't an airline pilot. It looked pretty boring to me, to be honest with you. Time for questions.
Ron, Becky, would you mention that one of the women lives here, is still alive and lives here in
okay.
San Diego?
My husband wants me to mention that there's I'm repeating what he wants. He wanted me to mention that the one surviving member of the ATA, man or woman, lives in Carlsbad. Her name is Nancy Miller Stratford, and she was written up in the San Diego paper last week in conjunction with the book coming out, and she's gotten a lot of other publicity as a result of it as well. She's still really got it together. She's 106, and she remembers everything like it was yesterday, and does say it was the highlight of her life.
The women were denied jobs after they got back, as you mentioned. Were their flying talents recognized, and were they denied just because they were women?
This question was, when the women were denied opportunity after the war, were their flying talents in question, or was it just because they were women? It was just because they were women. The airlines would not hire women, and the military would not hire women to fly. So it really didn't matter how good they were. It didn't come down to them proving their ability. They couldn't get a foot in the door.
in the Luftwaffe, women pilots? Were there women pilots in the Luftwaffe?
In the German.
Oh, were there women pilots in the Luftwaffe?
Yes.
Um,
Yes, they were called the Night Witches. They flew at night.
No, those were
The
Russian.
The Russians, I'm sorry.
Russian.
Russians.
I'm sure the Germans did too.
I haven't heard of German women flying. I know there were German women test pilots, and the Russians had women who flew combat called the Night Witches, and they made raids on Germany. Very effective.
Yeah, there were two famous German test pilots. One was named was Hanna Reich, and she flew everything, including the rocket-propelled airplane, the 163. The other woman, I can't remember what her name was, but she was a real specialist in dive bomb tactics. And the weird thing about it was she's Jewish, and she managed to keep her job.
Wow.
So that's really an odd story.
Yeah. Okay, should I pick people? There's a gentleman back here.
So large aircraft require more than one person to fly, bombers and so forth. Were there mixed crews? Were the women pilot command, or were there all women crews?
His question was, when there were aircraft that required 2 people in the cockpit, were they mixed crews or were they all women crews? They were mixed crews. In the ATA, they really didn't they didn't distinguish between men and women. They all did the same things, and when the women would fly the kinds of bombers that required a second person in the cockpit, they often had a man there doing it. The women also, I will say, I believe it was 1943, Parliament passed a law to give the women in the ATA equal pay to the men because they acknowledged that they were doing all the exact same work and they couldn't deny it. And it was one of the, it took decades before there were other equal pay laws to match this one just for these pilots. So I'm saying they were treated pretty well, really.
I thought one of the
For the
cool
time.
things, that picture in the book where it shows a woman standing on this massive bomber. She's not very big. And apparently her quote was something along the line of, "I don't have to lift the plane lifts me."
Right. Okay. There's a woman back there.
Could you talk a little bit more about your research process? And besides the Air and Space Museum, where else did you find information about?
Okay. She wants to know if I could talk a little more about the research process, and aside from the San Diego Air and Space Museum, where else I did research. There were only a couple of the women who had enough foresight to donate their papers to archives and institutions. One of them was Ann Wood, the college graduate. She had fantastic diaries and letters that she donated to the Stanford, the Hoover Institution at Stanford. So I got her information there. It was during COVID and the library was closed, so they would only give me so much at once. And there was one period when I only had the letters up to a certain point, and the man she had fallen in love with had just been shot down, and I didn't know what happened to him. And I was not eligible to get more papers for another 6 months. So I was actually pretty surprised at what happened when I found out, but it was killing me. So I could do that. And other than that, they were not famous enough to have information in museums. So I tracked down the families of these women. It was really hard to do. I found out if they had nieces or nephews or children, what their names were, and I would try to locate them. I had to find someone named Ann Smith. And I just cold called people named Ann Smith all around the country and said, was there a relative of yours who flew in World War II? But I did find her. And so a lot of these families, when I found them, did have diaries, letters, memorabilia, newspaper clippings in their attics. They went up to those attics and they got them out for me, and I was the only person ever to see them outside their families, and they were a treasure trove of information. I also went to Great Britain. The RAF Museum had the personnel records of all of the women, and Susie Glass, who's here, whose aunt was in the ATA. It's an example tonight. I gave her a copy of those records, which showed all of the dangerous situations she had been in. She was in 6 different crashes where aircraft failed, and each time she made it out alive and with the aircraft intact. So she was a really talented person. So I did that for each of the women, and I traveled around England to see where they had been so I could describe it. And I'm probably leaving out things that I did, but it was a lot of work because they weren't already known. but it was a wonderful payoff because here's the story that I pretty much had to myself. So it was a lot of fun to do it. I loved it. Yes, sir.
Growing up around 1940, we had a neighbor lady who had an airplane. She was a pilot. And I can remember seeing her in a military uniform, so I assume she was probably in the WASP. I know she was ferrying aircraft. That's what she was doing. And she survived the war, at least. So
Yeah.
I never got much background or other information about it.
Uh-huh. Well, he's saying that a neighbor when he was growing up was a woman and had a military uniform, and she was ferrying aircraft, and he assumes she was a WASP, and I think you have to be right. That was the only thing she could have been. So, yeah, that must have been fun. And as you say, she didn't talk much about it. This is why it's a treasure when we can get these stories, because World War II people didn't brag much about what they did.
By the way, one of the major B-24 factories was at the foot of Washington Street. Perhaps you know that they made like 6,500 bombers over 4 years. And that's where the Rosie the Riveter came from. They also made the Catalina flying boats.
Yeah, it's easy to forget how important the air war was in World War II. There's a lot about the ground troops, and they did obviously a super important job. But I think there's been less said about the importance of the air war and the manufacturing of enough aircraft in order to overwhelm the German Luftwaffe. And a lot of that was American manufacturing, British manufacturing, and the people who ferried the aircraft where they were needed.
The United States made 300,000 aircraft in 5 years and trained 200,000 pilots. So if you want to know the reason we really won the war, that had a lot to do with it.
Yeah. Sir, you had a question?
Yeah, fun fact is, well, not fun, but more B-17 crew members died than all Marines in World War II. So in terms of the air war contribution, it is significant. I did want to ask you, please, thanks for your work and thanks for bringing this out. Those are really strong characters, right, that you highlighted a few of them. Do you have anything on the interaction between them? I mean, was there a competition? I mean, this thing happened in the all-volunteer group with the men over in China, right? So I'm curious if there was the same sort of competition dynamic.
Oh, yeah. He's saying these women had strong personalities, and he's wondering, was there a lot of interaction and competition between them? The answer is yes. They were strong personalities. Each one wanted to be the best. And especially when they first got over there and they were training together a lot, there was a lot of competition to be the first one to fly the Spitfire. That was the biggest competition. The first one to fly a bomber. And there were a lot of individual rivalries there, and a lot of cooperation too. And the Americans often were scattered in different locations, but on their leave days, they would have 2 days of leave every 2 weeks. And they would usually go to London, and they were the toast of the town there. Americans often got together. As the war went on, more and more of their friends were British. And they would go to the Savoy and Claridge's and all of the top clubs and really let off steam. So they had a lot of interaction. And they were supportive of each other in a lot of ways, but also eager to be better than each other. No question. Sir?
Kind of a crazy question, but a lot of the pilots that I've met locally have fast cars. Did these women, did you learn anything about like what they did, after, during, with Jaguars, and I can imagine just all kinds of things.
Oh, such a cliche. He's saying a lot of the men pilots he has known had a lot of fast cars, and did the women also. Well, during the war, there was rationing, and it was very hard to have a lot. But Winnabelle Pierce, our wild woman, did have a motorcycle that she rode very fast, and sometimes 2 or 3 of her colleagues would sit on the back. They'd go into London, the clubs, on this motorcycle. The one wreck Winnie Pierce had in the entire war was on the motorcycle, and it was a pretty serious wreck. But they really, over there, that you couldn't get petrol, and you couldn't own cars. And I suppose once they were back in the U.S.,
Maybe.
I don't know, they probably couldn't afford fast cars since they couldn't get good jobs, but some of them did have aircraft after the war, their own private aircraft, yes. Yes?
did the ATA accept people of different ethnicities? And do we get to hear any of those ladies' stories in the book?
Her question is, did the ATA accept people of different ethnicities? The ATA did accept people of all races. Unfortunately, the U.S. military was completely segregated during World War II. Jacqueline Cochran, knowing this, I believe, did not take women of color to be, I know she didn't take them in the WASP, whether she deliberately didn't take them in the ATA or she couldn't find those who had those qualifications, it's not clear, but it is certain that she did not take women of color in the WASP. At the time, the research I've done showed that there were a couple of black women who could have had the number of flight hours to get into the ATA, whether maybe they weren't interested or whether Jackie Cochran just never invited them, I will never know. I think Susie had a question here.
No, I was just going to say my aunt, she didn't like fast cars. She was an ATA, but she would always buy the biggest, fanciest Cadillac. But she was taking care of my granddad, and he would take it out in the field to count his cows. And he destroyed every Cadillac she ever bought.
Oh, sad.
She was not happy about it.
I don't know if people in the back heard this, but Susie, whose aunt was named Grace Stevenson and was in the ATA, she doesn't know whether her cars were the fastest, but she always had to have a big Cadillac. And her grandfather would drive it out in the field to check on the cows and would wreck the Cadillacs. So that's pretty sad.
So if I could say something about Jacqueline Cochran, she actually tried to get 13 women to train as astronauts, and they passed all the physical things that they had to do, and the Air Force and NASA wouldn't accept them. Well, on the other hand, the people that did accept were all trained test pilots. So the women were flying small little airplanes as opposed to the test pilots. And I think one of the women that went up recently in one of the rockets was one of those women that had been theoretically qualified for that.
With Jackie?
Well, Jackie took the 13 women, and one of those women went up in one of the Bezos rockets, I think.
That was, the Bezos rocket. Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. With all your excellent research, finding the families and the material they had, is there a possibility that could all be collected and sent to the Air and Space Museum? Would families be open to that, or did you already ask them?
She's asking, with all the research that I did, and is there talk of some of this material from the families being donated to museums? And yes, the families are all talking about it now and deciding what they should do, and I'm urging them to do it. So that other researchers have access to it. Right now I've got it all.
And I'm involved with the museum, but obviously I know that we have a tremendous archive. When people have personal stories of their aunt or their uncle or father that came in and has a bunch of archives, they donate to the museum. What we typically do is we digitize them and give the original copies back. If I can add one story, a few years ago someone came in and they had a box full of medals and ribbons and a picture of a guy named Stan Anderson. The lady brought the thing in and she said, "This was in the garage, I think it was my uncle or something, not too sure, we don't know what to do with it, will you guys take it?" So when one of the curators opened the box, he looked at the picture, and we have a picture of the same guy drawn in 1942 at Dibden. He was an Eagle Squadron pilot. His name was Stan Anderson. And so I love to show a picture and tell the story of Stan Anderson, the Eagle Squadron pilot, and we walk around the corner and there he is with 9 other guys at Dibden in 1942. So anyway, I got to put in a plug for the Air Museum, so please visit us at the Air Museum.
There's a women's aviator museum in Oklahoma City. Both my aunts are in that one, but they have it's just women that were pilots.
Is there any evidence of, like, the Eagle Squadrons have a big towering thing in Grosvenor Park? Is there anything like that for the ATA?
The ATA Museum is in the town of Maidenhead, England. It's a tiny, tiny little house that was converted to the museum, and it has a lot of things stuffed away in it. but it's never had the kind of support that would make it a lavish museum with a lot of displays. I spent a lot of time there going through their material, but I mean, the public would be interested. They do have a Spitfire simulator that I flew very poorly. So they get some people coming for that, but it's just never, I think this whole story has not gotten the attention it deserves because it wasn't part of the normal military that we all know about. It wasn't the Royal Air Force, wasn't the US Air Force. It was this funny little organization that existed only during the war, and I think as a result, it hasn't got the kind of attention that a lot of other things have gotten.
Sounds like a movie.
Yeah.
Yes, it would be a good movie, I agree.
Once again,
Well, there's time for one question,
One more
apparently.
question? There was a gentleman way in the back, or a person way in the back, I
Well,
can't
that
tell.
was in the movie, that's why I was gonna
Oh.
ask if you had any movie interests.
Right here?
How did these amazing women even become pilots in the first place, given the time and maybe their lack of resources? How did they accomplish this?
She's asking how these women even became pilots in the first place, given the time and the lack of resources. Yes, it was an incredible feat just to get these pilot licenses. Someone like Virginia Farr, she had the money, she could pay and go learn to fly. There was another, one of the pilots named Suzanne Ford, she was called the Flying Socialite in New York. She also could pay for her lessons. But others just, they had a desire to be in the air. They loved that feeling of freedom, that feeling of control, that excitement, as one said, being close to God. All these reasons they wanted to fly, and they found ways to do it. One of them was named Mary Webb Nicholson. She was from North Carolina, and she did not have the money for flying lessons, so she bartered that an air show said they would give her free flying lessons if she would jump out of an airplane in an air show 3 times with a parachute. Now, she did this with no training, and back then parachutes weren't really strapped on your back, so she would crawl out onto the wing of a biplane, and then somebody would creep out there after her with this big puff of fabric in their arms. She would jump and they would go like this. I hope it would all sort itself out in the air, and she would land on the ground, and she did it 3 times, and she got her flying lessons that way. So Dorothy Fury, who was the very beautiful one, had a used Model T that she traded in for flying lessons because she had a boyfriend who let her borrow his car anyway, and it didn't matter. This will maybe be our last story. When she heard about the ATA, she decided to drive to Montreal, and she asked her fiancé, she called him, if she could borrow the car for the day. She drove it to Montreal. She sent him a telegram saying, well, I drove your car to Montreal. I've joined the Air Force. I sold the car, I needed the money. Needless to say, the marriage is off. And I will tell you, he came back to her and still wanted her to be his girlfriend after that.
Motto.
Oh, he wants me to end on the motto.
End with a motto.
The end of the motto is eager for the air. For the ATA, and that summed up this story pretty well, I think. Thanks.